There were many old taverns in Edinburgh, which were meeting places for lawyers, poets, intellectuals, clerks and ordinary folk who would while away the hours talking and drinking. One of these old taverns, and probably the most famous, belonged to John Dowie, consisting of some small rooms, with the largest holding 14 people, and the smallest, known as the Coffin, holding less than 6. It stood in Liberton Wynd, not far from the old toll booth and St Giles, serving food as well as drink. One of his specialities was Norloch trout, although in fact was simply stuffed haddock coated in breadcrumbs and fried in butter, while another was Welsh rabbits. His Norloch eel pie was also a firm favourite. The tavern stocked Edinburgh ale made by Archibald Younger at Crofton-Ree, and this attracted many customers to Johnny Dowie's Tavern, as it was known, due to its strength. He would serve the beer rather ceremoniously, bringing in the bottle of ale to the assembled company, drawing the cork, and pouring it into glasses, before toasting their health. He did this with every single bottle he served. At the end of the night, he would count the number of empty bottles, and this would allow him to calculate the night's takings. Every night, as St Giles chimed midnight, he would tell those who'd asked for more alcohol, "Gentlemen, it's past 12 and time to go home." On occasion, though, 2 or 3 clerks working for Sir William Forbes would be discovered in the morning, sleeping off the night before. Dowie never changed his style, and continued to wear the fashion of the mid-18th century, right up until his death. He wore a cocked hat, and knee and shoe buckles. Among those to frequent the tavern were David Martin, the portrait painter, and his young apprentice Henry Raeburn, Robert Fergusson, the poet, and David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher and historian. Robert Burns stayed at Baxter's Close in 1786 opposite Dowie's Tavern, and went to the tavern during his stay with friends. This led to it becoming famous, and many years later admirers of Burns visited it, especially the Coffin, where Burns sat and drank the night away. John Dowie died in 1817, having amassed £6,000 during his lifetime, leaving behind his second wife and the children from his first marriage. The tavern was renamed Burns Tavern, but was demolished to make way for the George IV Bridge in the 1820s. Another place of note was Peter Williamson's Coffee House, a little tavern tucked between the bookshops and Parliament House. When he was 8 years old, he was kidnapped from Aberdeen Harbour, where he was playing, and sold as a slave to a man from Perth who'd settled in Philadelphia. This gentleman had also been kidnapped as a boy, so understood what Williamson was going through. He treated him kindly, and when he died, left Peter £120, as well as a horse and saddle. At some stage, Williamson was captured by Native Americans, but escaped, joining the army. He was taken prisoner of war by the French, then discharged from the army due to wounds that had been inflicted. He boarded a ship and arrived back in his native Aberdeen in 1758, where he confronted the magistrates about his kidnapping, believing they'd had a hand in it. As a result, he was banished from the city. He made his way to Edinburgh, where he raised an action against the Aberdeen authorities at the Court of Session, where he was awarded £100 from them. With this money, he set up his little tavern or coffee house. Though the business thrived, it didn't bring in enough money, so he turned his hand to writing books, became a bookseller, printer and publisher. He wrote of his adventures in America, began a weekly magazine called The Scots Spy, and set up the first penny post in the capital. However, his divorce cost him dear. His wife frequented the lucky taverns of Mrs. Tate, Mrs. Lockhart, and Mrs. Johnson, where she enjoyed the company of gentlemen friends, but would return home drunk, leading to the divorce. His former wife and her father then set up a rival penny post office, and she took all she could get from him. Eventually he gave up his tavern and started to help his daughter, who knitted and washed stockings, to make ends meet. His fortunes improved, however, when the government took over his post office and granted him a pension. He returned to tavern life, opening up a tavern at Gavenlochsland in the Lawn Market. He died in January 1799, aged 74, and was buried in the Old Calton burial ground. Another tavern of note was Donnie, or to give him his proper name, Daniel, Douglas's, which was accessed down the dark and narrow Anchor Close. Situated on the left-hand side, the first thing to hit his patrons was the smell of cooking from the dark, fiery pandemonium of the kitchen. At the doorway was Donnie to welcome his guests with a bow. Along with his large wife, who always wore a towering headdress and a silk gown boldly patterned with large sunflowers and daisies, the couple made a fortune. The reason was that their suppers cost just sixpence, so it was very popular. The suppers on offer included tripe, rizzard haddock, minced scallops and hash. The tavern had a separate door that led to the Crown Room, which was used purely for Donnie's most important patrons. It was brightly lit, had 2 large windows, and a large fireplace. Ceremonial dinners were held there, and clubs such as the Crochallen Club met there. Among those to use this room was printer William Smellie, whose business premises were in the same close, and Robert Burns, who proofread his poems. Others of note included Adam Smith, the economist, Adam Ferguson, the philosopher and historian, and David Dalrymple, Lord Hailes, and James Burnet, Lord Monboddo, both judges. Donnie Douglas died on 3rd January 1788, aged 50, and the tavern was eventually knocked down in 1869. Fortune's Tavern sat in the old Stamp Office Close. It had formerly been the townhouse of the Earl of Eglinton, and the entrance was via a pillared doorway. This was a place where distinguished gentlemen met, such as the Royal Commissioner of the General Assembly, who would hold his soirees there. Following the elections of Scottish peers, and the ceremony following, they would make their way to Fortune's to hold the dinner. In April 1761, Dr. Jupiter Carlyle recorded that the day after his sister-in-law's wedding, the groom entertained his friends to a handsome dinner at the tavern, with the landlord charging no more than £half a crown a head for the 2-course meal and dessert. Thomas Blair, the duty comptroller of the Stamp Office, who was rather fat but short, would go to the tavern wearing a high-crowned cocked hat, perched on a wig, and held in place by wires, at least an inch from his head. He stood out at the annual Stamp Office dinners that were held there. Another event of note at Fortune's took place on 10th October 1775, when 20 nobles, gentlemen and clergy met the Duke of Buccleuch, with all of them wearing Scottish-made attire. The dinner was actually a wager on whose beef tasted better, the Duke's reared beef or John Lumsden of Blenheim's beef. After much deliberation, the Duke's meat won. Matthew Fortune, the old tavern keeper's son, continued in the hotel trade, opening a Tontine hotel on the newly formed Princes Street in the 19th century. Many of the Lucky taverns, as they were known, were run by women. Among these was widow Mrs. Flockhart of Potter Row, who ran her tavern at the end of the 18th century. The tavern was small and made up of a shop selling tea, sugar, porter, fish, vegetables and stationery, and an inner room which she used as a hotel, as she called it, and her home. Everything was neat, tidy and clean, and the old lady was known to her patrons as Lucky Fikey. Every morning she arranged 3 bottles of brandy, rum and whisky on her window seat, with glasses and a tray of ginger biscuits. Her biscuits were famous for being tasty and were a form of shortbread. Her regular clientele included Lord Braxfield, Henry Dundas, Dr. Cullen, and Walter Scott, the father of Sir Walter Scott. As she didn't charge in the usual way, she never needed a licence and wasn't classed as a tavern keeper by the authorities. Other Luckies included Lucky Wood, who ran an alehouse in the Canongate in the early part of the 18th century and served her guests goose pie at Christmas. Her food was well enjoyed, as she was an excellent cook and baker. She was well liked and became a kind of mother figure to the young law clerks in the city. Lucky Middlemas ran a tavern in the Cowgate near the South Bridge, which was frequented by Robert Ferguson. His thin figure, with shabby faded clothes and dirty stockings, fitted in well with the poorer people who frequented it, but he regaled them with singing and poetry recitals, and was well liked. Having little money, the tavern also suited his pocket, as a gill of gin cost 3d, and he was served with rizzard haddock or oysters, although latterly he could only eat pickled oysters, as raw ones didn't suit him. Lucky Jopp ran a tavern in Bailey Fife's Close. Mrs. Clark ran one in Writer's Court, and Lucky Johnson ran hers in Shakespeare Square in the 19th century. Lucky Lane ran her old tavern in the old toll booth, which was described as half tavern, half kitchen, but was cosy. She would cook beef steaks and serve ale and porter to her guests. Another 19th century Lucky, whose name has been lost over time, ran a tavern in the South Bridge Street, following her return from abroad, where she tasted continental cooking. The tavern was below street level, with its windows protected by iron bars, but the smell of her cooking wafted onto the street, enticing passers-by in. She became well known for her dish, Golly Gosperado, that she'd concocted herself, and due to its popularity, she earned enough money to become a pawnbroker and bought a villa when she retired. These are just some of the old taverns of Edinburgh that have long disappeared into the mists of time. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.